in listen-only mode.
Hello, I'm Pearl Jean Mabe, and I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Webinars are brought to you usually as a membership benefit of Heritage Ohio, but this month we're doing a special Preservation Month free webinars, so glad to have you with us. Heritage Ohio's mission is to help people save the places that matter, build community, and live better. Today we'll have a presentation on Ohio's architectural history. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, please type it into the question box at any time throughout the presentation. Most issues with the webinar software can be solved if you restart the program with the link that was sent to you. This webinar has been approved for AIA HSW continuing education credits. So please email as indicated in the chat box if you would like to receive credit or a certificate. So I'm just going to send you guys that information really quick. So as now indicated in the chat box, sorry. Our presenter today is Barbara Powers from the Ohio History Connection. And with that, I'm just going to get us started. So here you go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pearl. Good afternoon, everyone. We had a little technical difficulty, so hopefully if we spill over a couple minutes past the 2 o'clock hour, people will hang on with us. But let's get right to it. And why is it not advancing? Okay, great. Thank you. So there were our learning objectives, which you also have in your chat box. So early Ohio reflected a variety of cultural settlement patterns and, through the Public Land Survey, a checkerboard pattern of roads, lots, and farms that still defines the Ohio countryside. Ohio's 19th century architecture reflects the settlement patterns of the Northwest Territory and a state founded by Virginians, New Englanders, and Pennsylvanians, as well as Germans, Irish, Welsh, and Eastern Europeans. Ohio's settlers brought their building traditions with them. Master builders working in the state often utilized pattern books and builder's guides such as Asher Benjamin's The American Builder's Companion and Menard Lefever's The Modern Builder's Guide. Of course, some of the earliest, obviously the earliest landforms are our mounds and earthworks, but we're kind of jumping right into early settlement of the state. And some of the earliest forms were, of course, log constructions shown at by Moravian missionaries in Schönbrunn, which was settled in as early as 1772. But the first permanent settlement in Ohio, what was to become the state of Ohio, was of course in Marietta. And the Rufus Putnam House is the oldest known dwelling in Ohio that is still in existence. In 1788, Revolutionary War General Putnam led a group, the Ohio Company, New Englanders, to the mouth of the Muskingum River to establish Marietta, the first settlement in the Northwest Territory. The threat of attacks from the Native Americans subsided after 1795 when the Treaty of Greenfield was signed. The fort was dismantled at Marietta. Fort Washington, the fort was dismantled, and the timbers were reused to build houses in the town. When Campus Martius Museum was built in 1929, it was built over the Rufus Putnam House, which remains in its original location. The New England settlers also brought a strong academic ideals with them. When the land was surveyed by the Ohio Company, one section was reserved for schools, one section was reserved for religion, and two sections were reserved for universities. Ohio University in Athens, founded in 1804, was the first institution of higher learning in the state of Ohio and west of the Allegheny Mountains. Settlers brought with them their building traditions. In south central Ohio, many settlers came from Virginia, Kentucky, and Maryland. As a result, early buildings reflect an upland South and Virginian influence, as we see here in Adena, expressed in classical details and a detached or semi-detached dependencies. Adena dates to 1807. It was the home of Thomas Worthington, a Virginian, transplanted Virginian into the Ohio state. And it was designed by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, the architect of the U.S. Capitol. So I think it obviously shows a high degree of sophistication in the early state of Ohio. And it's part of what's known as the Virginia Military District. And this is land that was granted to Virginians for payment of military payment to veterans. Far more typical of houses showing this Virginian and Mid-Atlantic influence is the Mace House near Chillicothe. It is 2 stories high, 1 room deep with a simple gable roof. It has brick construction, often laid in Flemish bond pattern, indicating a very early house type, and has this symmetrical 5 or sometimes 3 bay center entry door and center entry hallway and chimneys. Mace also had migrated to Ohio from Virginia. An early stylistic type we see first expressed in Ohio is what's called the Federal style, seen predominantly in the late 1790s and into the 1840s. The United States was a fairly new country, but we still look to England and France for our cultural and artistic influences. This Federal style draws upon English forms and details, and often again it's transmitted to architectural styles in the United States through builders' guides, again particularly Asher Benjamin, American Builder's Companion, which was first published in 1806. We see here the Martin Baum Taft House in Cincinnati. It's one of Ohio's finest examples of the Federal style. We see the delicate ornamental motifs, thin, delicate window mullions, end chimneys, the dramatic center portico, and the delicate fan light and side lights defining the entrance. Again, the Smith Jessup House shows a little more modest interpretation of the Federal style, but still clearly identified through those delicate window mullions and the Flemish brick bond. The Connecticut Western Reserve was settled after War of 1812. Again, it's roughly the northeastern portion of Ohio and Erie and Huron counties, known as the Firelands. This land was granted to Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, and Connecticut then in turn granted land to people who had suffered losses from British coastal raids during the Revolutionary War. The sales survey and early settlement of the Western Reserve was conducted by the Connecticut Land Company, beginning as early as 1796. Settlers were largely from New England and also upstate New York. With them, they brought very distinctive town plans, as we see here in Talmadge. Talmadge was platted in 1806, and it's centered around a village green, just what the settlers left when they left New England to settle in Ohio. There are 8 roads converging in the town square. And the Talmadge Church, 1822 to 1825, designed by master builder from Connecticut, Lemuel Porter. And as we see from the plate showing Asher Benjamin's American Building Companion, we see those direct influences of those early building guides on builders and master builders in the Ohio, early Ohio architecture. I.T. Frary, who wrote one of the first architectural histories of Ohio, Early Homes of Ohio in the 1930s, quote, said, "The Congregational Church at Talmadge is probably the finest of early Ohio churches and compares favorably with all but the best examples in New England." Another style that very much is predominant and dominates early Ohio architecture, early 19th century Ohio architecture, is the Greek Revival. America shared a kindred spirit with Greece. They had recently had a revolutionary war, similarly in time to ours. Greek origins in democracy seem to be a logical link to American democratic ideals. So Greek architectural forms are appropriate symbols for our political ideas that our country was founded upon. Also, archaeological excavations served as references and also influences of Greek-inspired architecture. Greek Revival, as we can see here in the Avery Downer House, shows the classic influence of Greek architecture, particularly the temple form. Use of Greek orders of columns, the simple Doric or the little more detailed Ionic, and the Greeks didn't have arches, so we see flat lintels in the doorways and windows openings. But we also see this hint, as we see down in the upright and wing house type, of what's called cornice returns, as the cornice comes around and turns again at the roof line of the gable roof line to, again, sort of hint at the idea of a temple front. The upright and wing is a very common house type associated with this architectural style in this time period. It has this distinctive gable-facing two-story upright, and then often a 1 or 1.5 story wing that is not necessarily an addition, but was built at the same time as the house. And we see here this great example of this type and this house form being transmitted into Ohio from settlers migrating from New England and through upstate New York, with this similar example of the house type seen in Rhinebeck, New York. Greek Revival, of course, is associated with our earliest public and governmental buildings in Ohio. Between 1830 and 1860, nearly every courthouse and many churches in Ohio followed Grecian models. And one of the influential buildings in the United States was the Second Bank of United States, designed by architect William Strickland, very influential building. And of course, our own state capitol was designed beginning in 1830, stretched 22 years in its completion to nearly through the beginning of the Civil War. It was a very ambitious construction project for a young state, but it also set the tone and example, as we see in the Montgomery County Courthouse and even the smaller rural township hall, for stylistic references and architectural styles associated with these early government buildings. The Montgomery County Courthouse, designed by Howard Daniels from Cincinnati, is certainly considered one of the purest examples of Greek Revival interpreted in a public building. The construction of the National Road through central Ohio brought Pennsylvania Germans, and with them stone houses, inns like the Headley Inn you see in this image, taverns, and pike towns. The National Road, later US Route 40, passed through Zanesville, Columbus, Springfield, and Zanes Trace was another early road cut diagonally across the southeastern corner of the state. These early roads opened the state for westward migration and economic growth. As well, the canals were important means of transportation in this earliest portion of the 19th century in Ohio. The Ohio and Erie on the eastern side of the state and the Miami on the western side stimulated both agricultural and industrial development by linking Lake Erie and the Ohio River. So between 1820 and 1850, many Ohio communities made the transition from pioneer settlement to agricultural and industrial center. This period began with the building of the nearly 1,000-mile canal system and ended with the coming of the railroads. But into the second half of the 19th century, it would be the railroads that would project Ohio into the top ranks of industrial states. Ohio's location was centered in the expanding system of railroad lines connecting New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore with Chicago, St. Louis, and the expanding West. During this time period, we see more and more of an emergence of a popular culture. Capitalism is rising, beginning of an industrial system of mass production, mass distribution, produced new markets, new materials, and new techniques. Wire-cut nails, plate glass, standard size lumber, creating the ability to develop the balloon frame structure of construction. Ohio was moving away from its rural agricultural past towards a vibrant urban and industrial future. And with that, of course, comes suburbanization. In the 1850s, the village of Glendale, near Cincinnati, is believed to be the earliest known subdivision village in the United States. It's contemporary and actually predates Llewellyn Park, New Jersey. 600 acres of land were purchased in 1851. The village was laid out along Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton's railroad line. It was a rural location along the railroad, and along the railroad gave residents easy access to Cincinnati and other neighboring workplaces. The street plan, some of the earliest we see of this curvilinear pattern relating to the topography, is a radical change from the more rigid grid plans of the more populated urban centers that were common at the time. And it's dotted with new buildings, as subdivisions tend to be. And these are picturesque, Italianate, romantic style, mid-19th century style residential buildings and churches and other amenities such as the train station and schoolhouses. And these early suburbs become their curvilinear street patterns, the prototype for those designs come directly from another important property type of the time period, and that is the rural landscaped cemetery form. And Ohio once again factors in at the forefront of this model with Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, laid out by Richard Strauch, landscape gardener. It reflects, as I said, this early model of a picturesque landscaped cemetery with curving streets and vistas, pathways, lakes, and other landscape forms. Important pattern book from this time period is Andrew Jackson Downing's The Architecture of the Country House, first published in 1850. This pattern book, in addition to showing house plans and house styles, it also presented houses through elevations, floor plans, and other details, and had text that gave advice concerning the idea of aesthetic building. And it really is one of the first pattern books, first publications that starts planting that what would become the American ideal, and that is to strive for a single family home in a landscaped setting. And we'll see how that plays out. One of the most popular and prevalent architectural styles from this mid-19th century time period, not just in Ohio but throughout the country, is what's called the Italianate. And these are designs coming right out of pattern books such as Downing's, showing again these picturesque house forms in rural settings such as the John Gill Farm, a massive, huge house showing the agricultural prosperity of Fairfield County during the mid-19th century, but showing the hallmarks of the style. This large, squarish, block type house form, typically low-pitched, hipped roofs, wide eaves coming out being supported by brackets, topped often with a cupola, which was helped with air distribution and air circulation in the house itself. Taller windows, availability of larger panes of glass, and often round-arched window openings and door entrances. And I just show this to show you the widespread popularity of the Italianate. Houses, rural or urban, such as the example at the bottom in Springfield, Ohio, and commercial properties, as well as courthouses and public buildings and schoolhouses. Many of the early mid-19th century main streets are defined by interpretations of Italianate style architecture. Another architectural style of the same time period, again, these styles don't come and go right one after another. Often they blend together and are occurring at the same time, but these represent this mid-19th century romantic, picturesque approach to architecture, is of course the Gothic Revival style. And again, a perfect example of a plate right out of Downing's Architecture of the Country House, and we see the house clearly replicated in the Peter Neff cottage in Gambier. The Oak Hill Cottage in Mansfield is an excellent example of Gothic Revival. And Gothic Revival, as you might imagine, is defined by those steeply pitched gable roofs, that curvilinear, very ornate barge board or gingerbread as it's often called, and the use of pointed arched windows. And often those details carry right straight forward into the interiors of the houses as well. All of this detail is brought about because of that mechanization, the introducing of saws and machines that can machine cut these pieces of wood and these architectural details. And those railroads ship them to us. Another style, which kind of becomes the height of this late 19th century period and the availability of these materials and details, is of course the Queen Anne style, which is again drawing, its earliest examples are drawing from European sources, medieval expressions, but then get translated into a wide variety of architectural details and textures and materials and exuberance. It's sort of, they did it because they could. We see two examples in the background of pattern books, chapels, pilasters, palisters, George Barber, Scientific American House Design. Again, there was growing and growing and growing more prevalence of these publications. They're able to be more widely distributed. Materials can be mail ordered. No longer do you have to rely upon the materials that are most readily available to you, stone or bricks made on site. You can have the railroad ship you of a wide variety of details and ornament. And again, with that balloon frame house types, we start seeing these irregularly planned houses and framed houses, because you no longer have to have the walls be load-bearing, so you no longer have to rigidly adhere to a strict box shape. And the Bigelow House in Findlay is probably one of the most exuberant expressions of the Queen Anne that we find. It's also directly affiliated with the prosperity in Findlay in the late 19th century of the gas boom era. I picked these two buildings just because I think they are just such great examples of this growing cultural improvements and cultural facilities being developed across the state in Ohio. Of course, beginning naturally in 19th century Cincinnati. Cincinnati was a major city in the country at this time. It was known as the Athens of the West. It had rich cultural traditions and boasted a musical tradition from its German heritage that dated, was already a half a century old. By 1870, Cincinnati, the Queen City, was the 7th largest in the United States and a major commercial and cultural center of the Midwest. This combination of capital and culture was reflected in the complex musical auditorium and industrial halls of the Cincinnati Music Hall. Samuel Hannaford's red brick exterior reflected the era's fashionable high Victorian Gothic. Again, a lot of texture, a lot of details, a lot of ornamentation to the building. And in fact, the building the building's auditorium was the largest in the country until the construction of the auditorium in Chicago in 1889. Along similar lines, but in a very different section of the state, prominently anchoring the northwest corner of the town square, McConnellsville Opera House down in southeast Ohio, has continuously served the community entertainment center and meeting hall since its opening night of Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado in 1892. Opera houses were central to the social and cultural life of large and small towns during the last half of the 19th and early 20th century. And this golden age of opera houses coincides with the peak period of growth and prosperity in southeast Ohio's coal region. So, architectural styles directly influence and contrast and react to one another. And here's a great example is the introduction of the Richardsonian Romanesque in the late 19th century and an architecture that is heavily influenced by one single architect's work that was widely disseminated and published and known by architects and imitated and admired by architects around the country. And that was architect Henry Hobson Richardson. And we see down here in the little drawing, Richardson's Allegheny County Courthouse, 1884, and we certainly see its imitation in the Yost and Packard Wood County Courthouse in Bowling Green, 1890. Also residential, the Asa Bushnell House in Springfield shows this Richardsonian, and how that's characterized is through this sort of uniform look to the building, but this contrasting light and dark stone, use of heavy arches in the openings and arcades, and just overall typical use of stone, gabled, hipped roofs, often using tile to give it a little more heaviness, massiveness, but a little more detail and texture, but not as sort of chaotic as the Queen Anne. It's a little more refined, a little more unified in its approach. And the Asa Bushnell story tells an interesting story of Ohio as well. It reflects Springfield's heyday as an industrial center and the greater role Ohio played in the country's industrial history from the end of the Civil War until the mid-20th century. This home was the home of an important industrialist, later governor of Ohio. It shows that influence of Richardson's architecture. Bushnell was the principal partner of Warder, Bushnell, and Glessner. This was one of the nation's most successful manufacturers of farm machinery. And this corporation was headquartered in Springfield, Ohio, and later became International Harvester and was based out of Chicago. But and Springfield, Ohio at the time billed itself as the champion city because it was named so after the company's famous champion reaper. And there's a Richardson connection. Richardson designed the houses for Bushnell's two partners, Warder and Glessner. Warder's house was in Washington, D.C., and Glessner's was the famous Glessner House in Chicago. Bushnell was unable to use the benefit from Richardson's design because Unfortunately, the architect died a year before Bushnell's house was started underway. So to recap this period, we see the rapid industrialization and growth of railroads lead to the dramatic changes in American house design and construction. This growing industrialization permitted many complex house components, such as doors, windows, roofing, decorative details, could be mass-produced and shipped throughout the country by that ever-expanding railroad network. As I mentioned, there was advances in technology, indoor plumbing, central heating, gas and electric lighting, refrigeration, all changed the way houses were designed and utilized and laid out. And of course, the introduction of balloon framing, where you could use light 2x4 standard cut boards and standard mass-produced wire nails, enabling what used to take many, many days and many, many workmen could be frames for houses could be built in 1 to 2 days with about 2 to 3 workmen. So, from the end of the Civil War to the mid-20th century, Ohio was one of the most powerful and diverse economic centers in the United States. Location, natural resources, major transportation routes, and a plentiful labor supply made Ohio a chief player in America's industrial growth. At the turn of the 20th century, there was scarcely a growing industry in which Ohio did not have a major interest. By 1930, Ohio was the 4th most populous state in the country. This industrial growth changed the face of Ohio through immigration and urbanization, creating a large number of industrial cities: Toledo, known for glassmaking; Dayton, cash registers; Akron, rubber tires; Cincinnati, soap, radios; Cleveland, iron and steel, automobiles, electric lighting equipment. While many states have only a few major industrial cities, Ohio boasts a long list of smaller cities that added to the state's industrial output. Youngstown and Steubenville, steel production; Springfield, as we've already mentioned, agriculture and printing; Mansfield, appliances; Middletown and Portsmouth, steel; Zanesville, clay products; Lima, locomotives; Chillicothe, paper, and the list could go on and on. This industrialization shaped Ohio's late 19th and early 20th century built environment with technological improvements and new materials, factories, skyscrapers, cultural institutions, urban civic centers, impressive homes of industrialists, planned residential suburbs for the workers as well as the wealthy. So let's just look at a few of them. Ohio was a bridge between industrial centers of the East and the expanding West. Principal east-west transportation corridors crossed the state. Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, Great Lakes Port. It was 400 to 600 miles closer to the western markets at that time. It was the 4th largest city in the United States in the early 20th century. Cincinnati, we've already talked about the Queen City. Major river port. And within the industrial context of Cincinnati, we see the Gruen Watch Company in our lower right-hand corner, which is a factory that reflects the 19th and early 20th century development of Cincinnati as a center of craftsmanship and art. And this half-timber factory's distinctive architecture reflects the design and influence of the arts and crafts movement in America as it related to the worker and the workplace. With the auto boom of the early 20th century, the demand for rubber tires soared. Midwest auto manufacturers preferred to buy from suppliers closer at hand than New England rubber producers. Akron, firms of Goodyear, Firestone, and Goodrich became the 3rd largest tire manufacturers, the 3 largest tire manufacturers in the nation. 1920, Akron employed 73,000 rubber workers who produced 41% of the nation's rubber products. Akron's population rose 5-fold between 1900 to 1920, making it the 10th most populous city in the country. So with this industrialization, it brought large impressive homes and gardens of industrialists such as Kingwood in Mansfield, the Black Estate, designed by Clarence Mack, a Cleveland architect, landscape designed by Pitkin and Mott. It was associated with the Ohio Brass Company. Cultural amenities, formation of art museums in many of the leading cities. The Butler Art Institute in Youngstown was a building designed by the New York City firm of McKim, Mead & White in 1919. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, funded public libraries across the country and a fair share in Ohio, including the Columbus Public Library in 1906. Ohio sees this rise of industrial leaders as well. John Patterson with National Cash Register in Dayton, Harvey Firestone, and Frank Seiberling in Goodyear. These were national leaders in corporate welfare initiatives, housing programs, etc., and examples of early 20th century progressive era reform movement linked to improving working conditions in factories. Goodyear Heights is an example of workers' housing and a neighborhood developed in Akron for Goodyear workers. The neighborhood plan and landscape was designed by Warren Manning of Massachusetts, who also designed the landscape for Stan Hewitt, which was Seiberling's home and at the time the largest private residence in the state. In this political time period, I can't escape to talk about Ohio's presidents and link them to architecture. What could be better? During the last half of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Ohio became a powerful political as well as industrial force in America. From the end of the Civil War through the Roaring 20s, the nation elected 7 Ohioans to the White House. From 1869 to 1881, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, and James Abram Garfield. They were all military heroes in the Union Army. They served consecutive terms. Between 1889 and 1923, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, William Howard Taft, and Warren G. Harding were the 23rd, 25th, 27th, and 29th presidents of the United States. And Taft later became Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So these U.S. presidents, all from Ohio, well, most of them died while in office. So their legacy is for our architecture, these impressive Beaux-Arts monuments and memorials, which again help define this later 19th century, early 20th century time period in architecture of these grand classical statements in architecture. The McKinley tomb, they have these monumental stairs in Canton, Ohio, leading to the tomb. It's a dramatic setting. The McKinley Memorial in Niles has a sculpture of McKinley in the landscape and is actually a civic center of Niles, and also was designed by the firm of McKim, Mead & White. The Harding Memorial is Georgian marble, ionic columns designed by a Pittsburgh architect. All these architects were trained in the Beaux-Arts, the classical design influences in architecture. Along with political clout and economic prosperity, though, came negative effects. The state's tremendous economic industrial growth resulted in increased population and development of major urban areas, coupled with greater congestion, pollution, and risks of outbreaks of typhoid and cholera. The City Beautiful movement was a major influence in American urban design from the 1890s through the 1930s. It combined social reform with public aesthetic improvements that created a new sense of civic grandeur. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, often viewed as the beginning of the City Beautiful movement, actually helped to crystallize this already existing trend in civic improvements. But what the fair did was introduce this idea of monumental groupings of classical public buildings. And Cleveland's group plan, did you want me to pause?
Mm-hmm. We're having a technical difficulty.
Oh, oh dear. How much did they miss?
The internet went out, so it's trying to reconnect.
Mm-hmm.
So start a little bit back.
They missed my presidential?
No. So where was it?
It's still lost.
Oh, okay. Just start with City Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's still down. Internet is down. It's our internet. I don't know what
So people, there we go. It's back.
Sorry everyone, we were having some wireless internet issues, so we should be back and we'll get started again.
Okay, we're back to the City Beautiful movement. Was a major influence in American urban design from the 1890s through the 1930s. And it's influenced in part by the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, which introduced that idea of grouped classical monumental buildings surrounding often a water feature. And we see the Cleveland's group plan of 1900 to 1903 is actually one of the first examples in a major U.S. city of a comprehensive plan for clustering major public and government buildings. Daniel Hudson Burnham, who was the director of architecture for the World's Columbian Exposition, was a member of the Cleveland Group Plan Commission and planner of Cleveland's group plan. In this time period, we also see again examples of suburban development. Shaker Heights and Shaker Square in Cuyahoga County is a significant early 20th century planned residential community developed by Cleveland real estate developers. Shaker Heights is a major planned suburban community developed by Otis P. and Mantis Van Swearingen, known locally as the Vans. And hallmarks of this neighborhood that were influenced and carried over into other suburban residential neighborhoods throughout the country and in Ohio was the idea of design controls. Strict design standards required approval of all house plans by the Vans, which resulted in an architecturally cohesive community largely characterized by period revival style architecture, English, French, American colonial homes, designed by many of the leading architects in the Cleveland area. Also, we have the curvilinear street patterns, landscape design incorporated into the design, and public transportation. Cleveland, Shaker Heights, directly connected with the interurban rapid train system to downtown Cleveland and the terminal tower. And I love this little woodcut block in a promotional piece about Shaker Square and Shaker Heights with all these little Tudor Revival houses floating in the clouds. And architecture from this time period, residential architecture, definitely shows this influence of period revival styles hearkening and utilizing historic features, not imitating any one particular house, but take your pick, colonial, Spanish, French, Tudor Revival. So moving into the mid-20th century, mid-20th century Ohio was defined by the post-war production of consumer goods, tremendous expansion in suburban neighborhoods, and the construction of interstate highway systems and the Ohio Turnpike. After World War II, Ohio continued to grow and be a national leader in manufacturing and industry. Ohioans made up 5.3% of the nation's population and produced 6% of the gross national product, fourth nationwide. These goods were shipped via roads, rail, river, lake, and air, and continued Ohio's importance as a major distribution center. Expressions of modern architecture ranged from the international style, corporate headquarters, to Wrightian homes and dramatic religious properties. So this time period, architects, those architects that were trained in that classical tradition, creating designs with balance, symmetry, a hierarchy of spaces, drawing upon historical sources for style and details, such as we see in the Ingalls building, that traditional three-part tight division of space associated with early 20th century commercial high-rise skyscrapers. Well, these architects were tasked with, between World War I and II, needing to design architecture to address the modern era, or the machine age, defined by advances in technology, communication, transportation, and growth in government and big business. So these traditionally trained architects, whose work we see illustrated here, they address these challenges with coming up with an American modern style that still uses those recognizable classical images, that scale, proportion, and ornament, but in a more stripped down, clean, clear, modern form. Often also referred to as the Art Deco style. This is a term we use today to describe the architecture, art, and interior and industrial design of the 20s and 30s that show this streamlined modern form and detail. These architects, by their counterparts, were kind of called the half-moderns. They designed new material styles and they used new materials, but they used them in a recognizable images and proportions and ornament. So the contrast to that is modernism in the strictest sense of the word. And when we say modernism, we are talking about a broad term that encompasses, as you can see here, many approaches to design. Early 20th century styles in architecture gradually replaced some of those more classical, stripped down classical versions of modern architecture to represent this more radical modern 20th century machine age aesthetics. And these architects, mostly dominated by European design theories, many European architects such as Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Marcel Breuer, actually immigrated from war-torn Europe in the mid 1930s to come to the United States, and often they trained a new generation of architects in many of the U.S. architectural schools. But they were breaking from the past. They were no longer looking to a historical influence in architecture. They were presenting architecture that was focusing more on function, modern technology, and abstract design. International style is associated with this time period and with this wide range of architectural interpretations, and it is classified as ahistoric, abstract, machine produced. So just a couple examples here. Designed by the early modernist John Becker, the Rao House, down in the bottom right-hand corner, most strongly demonstrates this influence of modernism in residential concept and planning. The asymmetrical, unornamented building reflects the ideal of a building working as a sculpture set in the landscape. It is a two-story cinder block house with a flat roof, casement and glass block windows, rear terrace with steel railing, attached garage, and the house's asymmetrical facade reflects its interior room arrangements. Also in Cincinnati, the Terrace Plaza Hotel is Cincinnati's earliest and most important international style building and was one of the first modernist hotels in the United States. Its influential urban form of vertical slab skyscraper atop a horizontal terrace-based mixed-use program forecasted some of Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill's later and most famous buildings, such as the Lever House in New York City of the 1950s. Much of the Terrace Plaza's building designs were also done by Natalie DeBlois, a rare woman modernist architect working for SOM. The Libby Owens Ford building in Toledo displays the monumental abstract beauty of the glass box, which became the symbol of American business in this post-war era. And often some of these curtain wall skyscrapers were some of the first new buildings constructed following the Depression and World War II's hiatus on building construction within communities. This is a great example of this modernist skyscraper, rectangular form, module pattern expressed by structural frame and curtain walls. Subtle details, and the grid is frankly firmly expressed, the grid frame. Religious properties are often some of the most prominent expressions of modernism in many communities. The St. Stephen's Episcopal Church and University Center here in Columbus on the Ohio State University campus, 1951, by architects Brooks and Coddington, show that, particularly in the interior, that unstructured nave features a cathedral ceiling supported by a series of laminated trusts. And St. Stephen's was the first Ohio AIA 25-year winner. So looking quickly in residential, moving to Frank Lloyd Wright's contribution to modernism. His architecture evolves from the early 20th century prairie-style house of the open plan, linear horizontal emphasis, use of natural materials. Our only example of such of his time period is the Westcott House in Springfield. But he moves through that into expression of falling water in Pennsylvania, which is his link with this modernism international style, to his development of the Usonian house. This is Wright's answer to being able to produce homes to address the post-war housing shortage, and he creates houses that could be standardized, prefabricated plans, and often lead right to the development of the ranch and other forms of post-World War II housing. Usonian developed before the war, but it became the conceptual model for much of the residential building after 1945. The Weltzheimer Johnson House in Oberlin is Wright's first Usonian design in Ohio. And while we only have one prairie style, we have 9 Usonian designed houses by Wright throughout Ohio, with the Penfield House being another example. Usonian used standardized units of measurement and a standardized components in the floor plan, often incorporated inexpensive materials, concrete block, plywood, and very much an open floor plan. Again, all these hallmarks that lead us to the more popular housing interpretation of the modern ranch, post-war housing. Ranches have a couple characteristics that we see exhibited here. Large picture windows, be able to look right out there into the outside, and also this, again, open floor plan with moving away from front porches to the back patio terrace. Often the living room and dining room is moved to the back of the house, and the kitchen and service areas are more to the front. Attached garages, and differentiation between the public zone and the more private bedrooms and bath zones. So, to wrap up here, the 1970s brought dramatic and lasting change to Ohio. High labor costs, obsolete factories, competition from foreign imports, and reduction in the state's natural resources and energy sources caused many industries to leave the state, resulting in loss of jobs and urban decay. Ohio's post-industrial economy is driven by technology-based service industries, and smaller special companies such as the Longenberger phenomena. In the 21st century, the places that once produced tires, automobiles, and farm implements are coming back, though, as success stories of urban revitalization, utilizing historic preservation incentives to create housing and commercial spaces. Museums and other institutions by prominent international architects place contemporary Ohio architecture in the forefront of design and innovation. From the post-war modern contextual expressions of Michael Graves to the early experimental work of Peter Eisenman, as well as other well-known architects such as I.M. Pei, adding their designs to skylines. In closing, Ohio author Louis Bromfield once wrote, "Where exactly is Ohio? It is the farthest west of the east, the farthest east of the west, the farthest north of the south, and the farthest south of the north, and is probably the richest area of its size in the world." Still today, I think we've illustrated in this quick run through Ohio architecture that Ohio's diversity and balance between urban and rural, industry and agriculture, northern and southern, eastern and western, make it a state rich in architectural quality and character. Thank you. Do we have questions?
Yes, so I recognize that we did have some more audio problems a little bit just a few minutes ago, and I did want to let everybody know that in the post-webinar email, we'll be sending out the link to the recording, and typically the recordings do not reflect the issues that you might have had with your with our network connection issues. So if you did miss a few minutes just a few moments ago, they'll be in the recording if you want to go back and hear what Barb had to say. And so with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions that anybody might have. So you can type those now. We're getting all the questions that have been coming about the sound, so we should get your questions now. So we'll give everybody a few minutes for that.
So I was talking into the microphone, right? Oh, okay. Maybe I wasn't doing something goofy.
All right. Well, so I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. Let me double check one more time. Oh, here we go. So Roger wants to know, can you recommend several reference books on architectural styles?
Okay, well, let me make a plug for an Ohio project that many of us are working on. Is the Society of Architectural Historians, a national organization, has created what they call an online encyclopedia of architecture. And Ohio will be submitting our 100 top classic Ohio architectural expressions and places, and that'll be online. The first 50 should be online through the Society of Architectural Historians website within the matter of months. So we're quite excited about that. Probably the McAllister Guide to Architectural Styles is one of the best, most comprehensive publications that kind of walk you through styles and give you characteristics. It's focused mostly on residential, but you also can interpret that and often convey that out into more commercial buildings and commercial and public buildings. And but what style is it? I think it's published by Preservation Press still, is another book that gives you a very good overview of just several styles, and it's not just exclusive to residential buildings. But then there's other big surveys of architecture, Leland Roth's Guide to American Architectural History, and some other publications like that. I can give Heritage Ohio a couple titles that talk in a more, not so strictly, here's a style, but here's what architectural trends are happening across the country.
All right, and then Daniel wants to know, is it 49 South Main Street in Milan? And I'm not really sure, Daniel, what your question is. Could you rephrase it? And then another one is, when will Barb's book be published? So, do you have a date? Are you working on a book? Are you gonna publish?
Well, we're doing the Archipedia, which has, again, I've been working with 30 authors, but I don't know. In case you can't tell from my enthusiasm, I love Ohio, and I just think Ohio has such wonderful architecture, and it's up to all of us to go out and preserve it and do good work, such as all of us are doing, and through the state office, through Heritage Ohio, and through all of you all. But hopefully efforts like this help build that awareness for others to carry forward that idea of just how special we are and have been since our early beginnings. And we've got a lot out there to preserve. So.
Yeah. And then Erica wants to know, do you have a favorite resource that's particular to the Midwest? Maybe?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess that's why somebody should do something.
Your new book, perhaps?
Yeah. I.T. Frary's book that was done in the 30s is still probably a good focus on Ohio, but it covers its focus is mostly on early Ohio architecture. And I'm trying to think of there's been some compilations of articles and pieces, presentations and other short articles written on a number of Midwestern architectural topics. And again, I'm going to have to give Pearl some of those names of those titles because they're escaping me right now what they are. But there's a couple good publications that do cover some Midwestern topics. But there is a real gap, is what I would like to most likely say, is there's a real gap in that topic, as far as, especially focusing on Ohio topics. There's a need out there.
See a need, fill a need. And then we have one more question. Are you aware of other state historic preservation offices having architectural webinars in the Mid-Atlantic West regions?
I'm going to say no, because I don't know of any other webinars. I know Michigan, the State Historic Preservation Office in Michigan has certainly embraced and is working with the state economic development department to really publicize and gain appreciation for what they're calling Michigan Modern, really the strong connection Michigan has to the modern movement. So they may have webinars. I know they are publishing a book about Michigan Modern. It's coming out through the State Preservation Office. So you might look at just Google Michigan Modern to see what kind of online information they share. But that's one that comes to mind. But I'm not aware of others at this time.
Okay. And then, is there an architectural style that you would identify as most unique to Ohio?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think as you see, a lot of early Ohio architecture is influenced by the influences and the knowledge that's coming into us by those early settlers. And then in the late 19th, early 20th century, I mean, we're such a powerful force, so we have these incredible buildings reflecting oftentimes mainstream architecture and the work of important architects. But I think we have some homegrown architects that have a real impressive work and careers. And one that comes to mind, of course, is Frank Packard here in Columbus. His work really defines many small-time, medium-sized communities throughout the state. But then Walker and Weeks, Samuel Hannaford. I think Ohio, again, has a wealth of architects, local architects, that while they were still practicing in the more common nationally recognized styles and trends of the time, they are building and creating incredible properties that show really a real rich range of diversity, a richness in materials and character. So again, that heyday is the mid 19th to early 20th century. So a lot of the architecture coming out of that time period kind of in bulk is showing that prosperity, not so much stylistic.
All right. Well, I see that we have a few more questions, but I'm gonna send most of these questions to Barb so that she can answer them through email.
Right.
And so with that, I'm gonna wrap this up. Thank everybody for coming, and for our future webinars and other events, you can find them online at heritageohio.org. And thank you, Barb, for this wonderful presentation.
Pearl. This was fun.
And everyone have a great day.